Hi friends, and welcome back. So today I wanted to share this super simple and super cute tutorial with you, and all you have to do here is use some yarn and the chain stitch and embroider on a sweater for such a lovely outcome. There's just a few supplies you need to get started with this project, and obviously you're gonna need a sweater. I just thrifted this one at the thrift store. And then you'll also need some yarn, some cozy kind of chunky yarn, and I'm using this Loops and Thread brand and I super loved it. Then you'll also want to pick up yourself a darning needle, and lastly you'll want to get some of this sulky sticky Fabri Solvi. So this is basically sticky paper that you can print on, then you can peel it, stick it on your fabric, and then stitch the design on it. And after you're done stitching, you just dunk it in some warm water and remove the sticky paper. Alternatively, you could use a fabric marker. However, with that you're going to have to design it yourself and make sure it's centered properly. So this paper basically just takes all the stress out of that, making for a quick start into this project. To get started with this project, I first sized up my paper on top of my sweater to see how they lay. So the landscape orientation of this normal 8.5 by 11 printer paper seemed to fit my sweater better, but of course if you wanted a smaller name on it, you could print it in the opposite orientation. Next, I went ahead and opened my Canva account, and there I designed the name that I want to stitch, and I picked my favorite font, which happens to be a cursive font. It's called Twister. And then here I'm just kind of playing around with it to see if I like the J capitalized or if I like it better in lowercase. And once I have picked the one that I'm happy with, I'm gonna go ahead and rotate it so that it fits on my 8.5 by 11 in the landscape style, and I'm gonna enlarge it, and then you'll also want to center it up nicely. Centering up the name on the design now is actually very important and will make the next step of this process so easy for making sure that your name on the sweater is centered perfectly. Now for my name, I'm going to be using a white yarn, and then I'm going to be stitching it onto a brown sweater. But because my yarn is white, I don't want my ink to bleed on that. So what I'm going to do is turn the transparency down, and basically it just kind of makes it into a lighter gray. Because it's lighter now, the risk of it bleeding on my yarn is way less. So alternative to this, you can use the draft setting on your printer and print it that way. I do recommend doing a test run print first, just to make sure everything's looking good and sizing it up on your sweater before actually printing on the stick and stitch paper so as not to waste any. I'm happy with my test run, so I'm going to go ahead and print it on my sticky paper. Here I just removed the normal paper and put a single sheet in and hit the print button. Now I got a little bit ahead of myself here in the cutting steps, so before you cut it, what you'll actually want to do, if you centered up your name nicely in the middle of your design, you can actually just go ahead and fold it in half, and the edges of the paper will ensure that you folded it perfectly in half. Here I got ahead of myself, so I'm just using the two edges that were the edge of the paper that I snipped all around to help line it up, and that will just ensure that we find the exact center of your design, and then that'll help lay it on nicely, ensuring that your design is not crooked on your sweater. So if you skip that step like me, just go ahead, fold it in half, and there you can see that I have a straight line so that it lines up perfectly. Once you do have that lined up, then you can go ahead and cut it out, and the crease in the middle of your design will have already been made for you. After you're done cutting, be sure to save these scraps because you can ink little designs on them and then use them again for stick and stitch on other clothing or other pieces you have at home. To prep my sweater for stitching, what I'm going to do is simply fold it in half with the front side of the sweater on the outside of the fold, and I'm just going to make sure that everything is lined up. The sleeves, the collar, the bottom, the armpit, just making sure all the seams are nice and lined up to find the true center of the sweater. So I've found the center of my sweater, and I'm marking it by remembering these two little rivets in the middle, and I'm just using a scrap piece of thread and a little needle to insert that thread to let it dangle through so that I know which two grooves in my sweater are the center lines. And then I'm just gonna set my needle, my darning needle at the bottom, to mark the center one at the bottom, and then I'm simply just gonna line up my design in the middle of that. As it's already been folded, what I want to do is put that fold in the middle of those two little grooves. So once I have my design nicely lined up and that fold lines up with the center rivets of my sweater, I'm gonna go ahead and peel the paper off of the back of the name, and I'm simply just going to stick it on my sweater. And once I've got it on there, I'm just gonna kind of rub it in place to ensure that it doesn't move whenever I'm stitching, and just make sure that it's lying nice and flat and even. And now that all the prep work is done, we are ready for the fun part, and we are ready to get stitching. So I'm just twisting my yarn up here and then inserting it into my needle, and you do want to leave a little bit of a tail at the top of your needle eye. And then you'll also just want to go ahead and tie a knot at the end of your yarn, and you also want to leave a bit of a tail here because we'll want some yarn to work with to be able to tuck that in and finish our piece off in the back. To officially get started stitching, I actually want to hold my sweater in the direction that I'm going to be following these little lines of my printed name. So I'm going to be stitching in this direction. For now, I'm going to skip over the little dot on the J, and I'm just going to start where we're going to make quite a few chain stitches. So it might feel a little bit awkward at first to get tucked away under the sweater, but you want to come up through your sweater, through either the neck hole or the bottom. As you go, you'll find something that feels a bit comfortable to you. It'll definitely feel different, like if you're used to stitching on an embroidery hoop. So there's a little bit of like a weird feeling learning curve, but no worries, you get it as you go. So here I'm just coming up with my needle at the top of my J, and I'm gonna go ahead and pull this needle and my yarn all the way through, so our knot should snag on the back. And that's what we want. We don't want our knot coming through, and then later we will go ahead and stitch that little tail in to tuck in that end piece. So now that I have my thread sitting where I like it, I'm gonna go ahead and make the chain stitch. To do that, I'm gonna go down either like right in that same spot I came up or right next to it, whichever is close enough. And then I'm gonna pull my needle and thread through, and now I'm pulling through the inside of my sweater. You also want to make sure all your other little thread strands are away because mine kept getting caught in it. So here I have created this little loop, and what I'm going to do is come up a little stitch length away through my sweater and through the sticky paper on that J line. Sometimes it can be a little bit hard depending on where you come up, so you do have to do a little bit of tugging. And then I'm going to put that loop over my needle, and this is going to create our first chain. Then I'm just simply pulling my yarn through, and I want it to wrap around that string nicely. Now you want to be careful not to pull too tight, or else it'll kind of pucker your sweater. So you want it to be not too tight but not too loose, and you'll find that happy medium as you go along. So that's our first chain stitch, and now we'll get started on the second one. To create our second one, we're gonna go down right where we just came up, which is actually in the center of that first chain stitch, and we're gonna go ahead and pull our needle and yarn through, but be careful not to pull all the way through, because remember, on the front we need our needle to go through the center of that loop. So here I have my loop set in place, and I'm going to go ahead and bring my needle up another stitch length away, and I want to try and keep these as uniform as possible. Personally, I just eyeball all of my stitch lengths, but if you really wanted to, you could take a little pen or something and mark and measure out a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch or whatever stitch length you wanted your stitches to be, but I just like to eyeball them, and it seems to turn out just fine. So again, here I'm pulling that yarn, and that tightens up my stitch to create our second chain stitch. And so basically you're just going to do that through all of the letters on your design, but there is kind of a quicker way to go about doing this. So to do that, what you're going to do is go down right where you came up, and then you're just going to go ahead and push your needle through your sweater the stitch length away. And as you can see, the way I placed it, my yarn was in my left finger and this is a giant loop. So all I have to do is pull my yarn and my thread through, and I'm already inside of that chain stitch to create like the perfect little loop. So that's just kind of a way to get going on your design at a quicker pace. And then I also like to kind of pull my chain stitches like I just did there to make sure it's lying nice and even and flat. So here we'll do that again. So I'm going down right where I just came up, and then I'm coming up through my sweater and the sticky paper a stitch length away, making sure my yarn is on the left side and therefore my needle is already inside that loop. All I have to do is tighten it to create that chain stitch. And so there you are, and what I'm going to do is basically just stitch all of my letters. Now, if you did choose a cursive font, there definitely comes some point for some overlap to be done on your design. But what I like to do when coming across these points where there is going to be overlap, imagine you are writing this with an actual pen. So if I were to do that, I would be going down this J and then up and crossing over that original first part that I wrote. So since I'm just going over it as if I was with a pen, I'm just going to go over it with my yarn and my needle. So to do that, I'm actually kind of coming up and around the other side of those chain stitches, and I'm just simply overlapping this chain stitch, and it's going to sit over top of that original layer of chain stitches that I made. And from there, I just proceed on. At this point, I am nearing the end of my first letter, the letter J, and so what I'm going to do is just make my chain stitches as close as I can to where that letter ends. And as soon as I make the last chain stitch, I'm going to do it a little bit differently. So instead of going down right where I just came up, I'm actually going to go down just outside of that stitch to kind of lock it into place. So here I'm inserting my needle over top of my last chain stitch to hold that stitch in place and pull my yarn through all the way to the back of my sweater. And this creates the perfect stopping point for the stretch of yarn that I've been stitching with. So to tie things off in the back, what we're going to do is maneuver over to the back and kind of flip the sweater inside out. And what I'm going to do is just weave my needle in and out of some of those white yarn stitches in the back. If you want to, you could also go ahead and make your knot first. You can do it either way. But here I'm just weaving under a couple of those stitches, and then I'm just going to secure things in place with a double knot. To create my double knot, I've created a loop here, which I'm going to go in with my needle, but I'm not going to pull it all the way through. I'm going to grab that yarn that I just put in there and actually pull on that. That will create the first knot that you saw got tucked away, and then I'm going to go in through that loop, and this is just a little trick to make a double knot. You could totally just double knot it like normally, but that's just a little trick to get it done. And it's good to make sure on the front that things didn't get pulled too tight, so I'm just kind of stretching it out there. And then I'm just going to weave my yarn in again underneath a couple stitches, and then I'm good to go ahead and snip that off. So everything is secure in place, and this helps keeps things nice and tidy in the back. It's good to go about weaving your ends in right after you're done stitching instead of leaving them towards the end, because oftentimes they will get caught in your other stitches and then it will turn into a bit of a messy back, and it can also get a bit knotted up. So best to do it as you go along. So that means it's also a great time to go ahead and weave in that first tail whenever we first started stitching, that one that's been hanging out this whole time, and go ahead and just do the same exact thing with that to clean it up. So that's one letter down and 5 more to go. So here I'm going to start my O here, go up and around, loop around, connect to the S, and that's going to be my next stopping point. Then I'm going to start again at that S where it connects to the I. That's where I can stop with my yarn and get some new yarn. My I can start and stop. My A can start and stop there, and then I will connect over to the H and go down. And so throughout the name there are a couple different places that are good stopping points, pretty much per each letter, or where there's too far of a stretch to get your yarn to connect to the other spot. So you can start and stop just like we have done with this J for the remaining number of your letters. If you ever do get to a point where you're running out of yarn and you didn't quite finish your letter or get to that great stopping point, what you want to do is just finish your stitch as if you were at the end. So you want to bring your needle down outside of the edge of that chain stitch, bring it through the back and pull it all the way through, and basically you're just going to tie off your yarn and knot it in the back like I just showed you. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here, and then I'll show you how to restart it. To restart, I've gone ahead and cut a stretch of yarn, and I've created my knot on the end with a bit of a tail. Now I'm going to come up through the bottom of my sweater, and I'm going to come up through the middle of that loop of that chain stitch. So basically I'm just pretending as if I didn't tie off and just proceeding with coming up through the middle of the chain stitch. So I'm going to pull on my needle, and I'm going to let my knot catch in the middle so that I can pull my yarn all the way through. Once I have it pulled through, I'm going to go right back down where I came up through the middle of that chain stitch, and then I'm going to pull my needle through. Sometimes with the knot being started at the very beginning, it can be a little bit crowded and a little bit tricky with your yarn to pull through, so sometimes it does take a little bit of finagling to get it pulled through, and so that's why I pulled my yarn all the way through instead of kind of doing that shortcut. So here I'm just going to make sure my yarn is lying nice and flat and not twisted up, and continue pulling until I create that nice little loop for my first chain stitch. Then I'm going to come up through the bottom of my sweater a stitch length away and go through the center of that loop, and then basically I'm just going to proceed on as normal. So that's how you can get going if you end up running out of yarn halfway through a letter. At this point, I have finished chain stitching all of my letters except for the little dot above my J. So for this, I could totally just create a single chain stitch, but I actually went ahead and I added a French knot. To make the French knot, what I'm going to do is bring my yarn up through my sweater. I'm going to wrap it around once, wrap it twice, and then I like to use my finger to hold things in place, and then I'm going to angle it down to go back where I came up or just right next to it. Either one is fine. And I'm going to hold things in place with my left hand there to keep that little loop secure, and I'm just going to pull my needle through, and that'll basically create a little knot, and that'll be perfect for the dot above my J. Now again, you could totally do a chain stitch, totally optional and up to you, but I really love the look of the French knot, and if you want a more in-depth tutorial on that, you can check out the video linked above. And now here, all that's left to do is tie it off, and my stitching phase of my sweater is complete. To remove the sticky paper, some of it is already peeling up, so I'm just going to kind of help it peel up a bit more and cut off that excess. Now this step is totally optional. You could just leave it, and if you leave it, that just means you have a little bit more to rub off in the water, but either way is totally fine. If you do choose to peel some up and cut it off, just be very, very careful that you don't cut through your sweater. It might be a little bit of a dangerous step, so if you don't feel comfortable doing that, totally just, it can all be washed away under the sink. So here I'm peeling it up, and I'm going to cut a little bit of the excess off. Next, all I have to do is run my sweater underneath some warm running water and just kind of rub around on the sticker, and it dissolves with the water. So it is super handy and very easy to work with. It is good to kind of get in between and kind of under those stitches to help kind of agitate and rub it off. It just takes a few minutes, and then after you have rubbed it all off, you can let it hang dry, or if you're brave, you can put it in the dryer and see that things are okay there. To be honest, I did put mine in the dryer. This was a thrifted sweater, so I was pretty confident by the looks of it that it had already been shrunk a couple times, so I wasn't too worried about it. But definitely be sure to wash it, and if you do plan on drying your sweaters, dry it before you stitch on it so that it doesn't shrink in the process. And that's all there is to embroidering your own custom name on a sweater. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and have so much fun stitching up these names, and until next time, my friends, happy stitching!